The Brazilian Congress decided to investigate the January 8th riots in Brasília. The investigation promised to identify those who ransacked government buildings, as well as the people who incited and financed these actions. But it is ending in a damp squib. Marred by culture wars and political bickering, the committee failed to bring any major breakthroughs in the investigation. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. This is Explaining Brazil. If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We are an independent organization funded by our subscribers. You can help us stay independent and continue to produce award-winning journalism. But if you are already a subscriber, then you can go the extra mile and enjoy our Buy Me a Coffee fan page. In return, you get exclusive perks like special newsletters and behind-the-scenes content, as well as a shout-out here on our podcast. Today I'd like to thank our Buy Me a Coffee members, Gabriel Luca, Andrei Novoseltsev, Tom Nolan, Marta Martins, Pen Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Caroline Hilbert, Mark Hillary, John Thomas III, Luis Hans, Erwan Menes, Orlando Black, Steve Knapp, Aaron Berger, James Coney, Kars Vresvik, Alasdair Townsend, Peter Abrahamson, Jim Awofadeju, Michael Fryer, Miller Renascido, David Dixon, Jose Rosi Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Yarden Iftah, Tonika Thompson, Anderson da Silva, Kat Kramer, Peter Suffering, Anna Lund, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. And our Buy Me a Coffee members come from all over the world, so please, if we are butchering the pronunciation of your name, do send us an email. And if you too believe in the importance of independent journalism and want to hear your name on our podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of the membership levels. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to learn more.
Que estejamos sempre prontos a reagir em paz e em ordem a quaisquer ataques extremistas que queiram sabotar e destruir nossa democracia. Viva o Brasil e viva o povo brasileiro!
The year started with a bang for Brazil. On January the 1st, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was inaugurated as president of Brazil, promising to recover the country from the mismanagement of the Bolsonaro era, and also to preserve democracy, which had come close to a point of collapse in 2022. We shall remember, Jair Bolsonaro spent years trying to delegitimize the country's voting system, claiming, and doing so without any proof, that Brazil's electronic voting machines could be hacked and that the results could be tampered with. Under his watch, the Federal Roadway Police carried out a voter suppression operation in Lula-leaning areas, staging roadblocks that delayed the commute of millions to their voting stations. After losing by a razor-thin margin, Bolsonaro never officially acknowledged the results, which fueled his supporters to try blocking federal roadways that are essential to Brazil's supply chains, in protest against what they saw as a stolen election. When these roadblocks didn't work, far-right supporters set up campsites outside army garrisons, asking for a military coup that would prevent a peaceful transfer of power. But when Lula took office, it seemed as if democracy had surpassed its toughest challenges in decades. However, just 1 week into his term, Brazil saw the biggest assault against democratic institutions since the military dictatorship came to an end in 1985. Thousands of far-right radicals invaded the buildings housing Congress, the Supreme Court, and the presidential office on January the 8th, 2023. For comparison's sake, it was as if the pro-Trump January rioters had not only stormed the Capitol, but also the Oval Office and the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. The rioters destroyed architectural gems and precious artwork and brought the country to the edge of its seat. Authorities responded swiftly, arresting and indicting more than 1,400 protesters. Weeks later, Congress decided to conduct an investigation of its own. Cedê Silva is the Brazilian Report's correspondent in Brasília. Cedê, thanks for being with us again. So tell us, how was the process of creating a select committee to investigate the January 8th riots? Because the push for this investigation came from the oddest of places.
Yes, it came from an odd place. So initially, the people requesting the investigation were actually in the far-right opposition to the Lula administration. And the author of the request, of the motion for this committee, is Congressman André Fernandes, who is a member of the far-right and a member of Mr. Bolsonaro's Liberal Party. So their objective initially was to use the hearings committee to basically gaslight the public, to mislead the public about what happened, and to portray the riots as an actual conspiracy by people in the left that had supposedly infiltrated the movement, and also blaming the movement exclusively on the negligence of the Lula administration rather than on the active conspiracy by Jair Bolsonaro and his supporters.
So you say the government was worried about the far-right's attempt to shift perceptions around January the 8th. In the end, what forced the government to change its mind and also call for a probe?
So back in April, TV network CNN Brazil aired surveillance footage that showed part of the military, including Lula's then Minister for Security, General Gonçalves Dias, inside the presidential palace on the afternoon of January 8, and apparently with a friendly attitude towards the rioters. So from this point on, this convinced President Lula to use the committee to portray himself as the victim of a coup, as opposed to just being a negligent actor in handling security at the palace. So this was when lawmakers friendly to the Lula administration also started supporting the committee, which led to the committee's creation sometime later.
We all know that depending on who sits on a select committee, that means whether or not we will see diligent work being done. For instance, the Jair Bolsonaro administration allowed the opposition to control the hearing committee that examined his COVID response, and that led to thorough investigations that exposed Bolsonaro's playbook of denialism. What about the January the 8th hearings? The left got a majority in this committee too.
Yes, which meant that the committee had backfired from the start regarding the right-wing initiative to create the committee in the first place. So from the very beginning, the Lula administration was able to secure a majority in the committee. So a majority of the lawmakers in the committee are friendly towards the Lula administration, including the most important figure, which is the rapporteur, Senator Elisiane Gama, who was in charge of drafting the final report. We also know this because at the time, the opposition whip in the Senate, Rogério Marinho, complained about some procedural rules that facilitated this majority for the government. And in the first hearing of the committee, we had opposition lawmakers saying or requesting that the committee should have sub-rapporteurs, deputy rapporteurs, or should also submit a different report. So from the very start, the opposition knew that they had lost the game when the team was formed against them, when the team had a majority of Lula supporters.
Both sides promised to expose the other. Like you said, the far right wanted to portray the government as maliciously negligent, and the government wanted to expose far-right putschism. Many believe this committee could dominate the headlines in the same way that the COVID hearings did, but that was never really the case, was it?
Yeah, so on some moments and some key hearings, the committee had a lot of exposure and there were very important hearings. But from a certain moment, the committee sort of lost appetite, especially after Supreme Court justices started authorizing the people under subpoena not to say anything or not even to go to the Senate room where the committee is held. And also, some of the hearings did not reveal anything much. So there was sort of a culmination point where after the committee had a lot of attention and there was some important hearings, the committee sort of lost appetite, lost bringing new information, and it actually is ending sooner than the deadline. It is ending before the deadline, and it's not being renewed. And this report is a way of finishing up before the deadline they could have.
Cedê, you mentioned that Supreme Court justices allowed people that should testify maybe not to say anything or also to skip their deposition altogether. On what grounds did they do that?
Well, on legal grounds, under Brazilian law, if you were investigated, you do not have the obligation to produce evidence against yourself. So in some of these cases, since the people were under investigation in other under the judicial or under the police branches, so they're not obligated to formally testify. This was also the reason why former Justice Minister Anderson Torres, he got to skip several times hearings at the local Brasília Legislative Committee that also investigates the January 8 riots. And in the end, he decided to speak first in the federal committee, the committee that we're talking about, rather than the local legislature, because investigated people are not obligated to go to a select committee because that could produce evidence against themselves.
So, Cedê, we have the judiciary conducting investigations, a local legislature in Brasília beginning its own probe, as you explained on the Brazilian report. So did the Congressional January 8th hearings, which came after court's investigations, after Brazilian investigations, did the federal Congress hearings bring anything new to the table?
Yes, it did. We're going to talk about that later, but we had the hearing by hacker Walter Delgatti Neto, which did bring some new, never before revealed information. And it was also important that the work of the committee was compared also to the Brasília local committee. And in these differences, some things came to light, which later were important enough to convince people not to testify again. So this is the case, for example, of former Deputy Intelligence Chief Marília Ferreira Alencar, who worked under Anderson Torres both in the Justice Ministry in the Bolsonaro administration, and she also worked with Anderson Torres later in the very brief period they worked for the Brasília government earlier this year. So Marília Ferreira, she went first to the local Brasília committee, and she was very eloquent about intelligence reports concerning the January 8 riots being messaged to important police officials in the Brasília security apparatus, in the Brasília security department. Later, however, police investigations that leaked and showed WhatsApp messages of the police commanders and of important people in the Brasília local police talking about the coup, talking about their electoral preference, talking about they were not concerned about the Bolsonarista far-right demonstrators camped in Brasília, and so on and so forth. And what happened was, when Marília went to depose on the federal committee, she remained silent. She didn't want to go, and she in fact asked for a judicial permission not to go to the committee and not to say anything, which is which reveals to us that the investigation and her deposition to the local Brasília committee were important enough to affect that she did not want to speak again at the federal committee. So in the end, the federal committee also served to highlight these differences, because you also had the local Brasília committee going on, and the contrast between what people say in one thing and the other, or they do not want to say on the other, is also informative.
And was there any bombshell deposition? I mean, you mentioned the deposition of an infamous hacker, Walter Delgatti Neto.
Yeah, so in my understanding, the most bombshell deposition, the hearing that revealed at least more new information that still needs to be verified but holds water so far, is that of hacker Walter Delgatti Neto, because Walter Delgatti Neto revealed that he was essentially hired by the Bolsonaro administration, and that he went to the defense ministry a few times as part of the defense ministry campaign at the time to discredit the electoral system. So Walter Delgatti Neto is a famous hacker. He's famous in Brazil because he is one of the hackers involved in the so-called car wash leaks. These are hackers that exposed the Telegram messages by former Judge Sérgio Moro, former prosecutor Deltan Dallagnol, and all the other stars of Brazil's greatest anti-corruption investigation, which was car wash. And Delgatti Neto was in the team that exposed Telegram messages that showed that Sérgio Moro and the prosecutors were in cahoots. And this hack was important for the judicial branch to later acquit Lula, or at least to release Lula from all charges. And Lula, who had already been released from jail, would not go back to jail again because a lot of the investigations of car wash were essentially canceled. So what Walter Delgatti said to the lawmakers was that in his role in a great hacking scandal that was favored by the left because it helped to keep Lula out of jail, he had the credentials. He could not be accused of being a right-wing man by people in politics. So he would have credentials when saying that the electronic voting system in Brazil has a problem. He could not be considered a right-wing conspirator because he was not in the right wing in the first place, and he was actually friendly to people in the left and in the Workers' Party. What Walter Delgatti said was, at the time, what was happening was that the source code for the electronic voting machines was available for people to inspect, and that includes the military forces. So what he told the committee was that military officers would go into the room where people can see the source code. They would note down things, and they would bring information back to him in some attempt to discredit the electoral system that never actually took place. But the important thing that people need to be reminded here is that Walter Delgatti's actual skills in hacking the electronic machine, which are non-existent, by the way, were actually not relevant. The relevant thing was to use his brand, his name as a famous hacker, and have him say something or test something or do a fake test of something that would say that the electronic voting machines could be hacked. And this bombshell hearing was important enough that Defense Minister José Múcio Monteiro, who is the defense minister of the Lula administration, has publicly requested the federal police and the Supreme Court for information on the investigations as a way to protect the military from such a scandalous hearing. And it's also important that Defense Minister Múcio did not initially deny these allegations. And everything that Walter Delgatti Neto said makes sense and fits with other dates. We have pieced those things together in the Brazilian report. So even though some of the things he said still need to be verified and cannot be taken at face value, the things he said make sense, and hence it was a very important hearing.
Right, and what was missing from the investigation?
In my understanding, the main thing missing from the investigation is going after the core of the armed forces. So Senator Elisiane Gama is requesting the investigation of former President Jair Bolsonaro and a total of 8 generals and 1 Navy admiral, but it does not go after the large top brass of the military and their self-professed role that many of them still believe that they still have a role to play in Brazilian politics and a role as a sort of moderating power. It does not address the issue, and in fact claims that the military held a posture in defense of the Constitution, which is clearly not true, because during the Jair Bolsonaro administration, among many other things, the Defense Ministry issued a statement in which it officially claimed that it had found no irregularities in the electronic voting machines, but it could not completely underwrite their safety. So the Defense Ministry was still playing with the card that the electoral system could not be completely trusted until the very end. And more than that, as the report shows, the camps nearby the military bases, including the Army's headquarters in Brasília, were tolerated by the military, and there are a lot of retired military and a lot of people in the family or military relatives in those camps. So the military had an instrumental role in the attempted coup, and it was not the work of just a few generals, as the report says.
Okay, now you said what wasn't in the investigation, but what was it? Senator Elisiane Gama acted as rapporteur of the committee, and she presented her final report on Tuesday with the main conclusions of this probe. What are the report's main topics, main conclusions?
So the final report by Senator Elisiane Gama has some very important points and has a very extensive narrative showing how the January 8 riots were not a spontaneous thing, and they're actually the culmination point in a long campaign to discredit the electoral system, and this campaign was led by former President Jair Bolsonaro. So her report shows how President Jair Bolsonaro, since he was president, he went through several attacks against the electoral system that includes press conferences, interviews, declarations, statements, the initiative for a constitutional amendment to bring back printed receipts because the voting system could not be trusted, the meeting he held with foreign ambassadors last year in order to discredit the electoral system before foreign governments and trying to convince them not to immediately recognize a victory by Lula should it happen, and many other things, including the camps and the December 12 attack on the federal police and the December 24 bomb plot in the Brasília airport and so on. So her main point is January 8 was not a separate thing. January 8 is the culmination point in a long campaign led by Jair Bolsonaro to discredit the electoral system and either not have elections taking place, reverting the electoral system, or trying to overturn the election later or place the military in power with the attempted coup on January 8.
And based on these conclusions, what did the report recommend?
Among the main recommendations, she requests the investigation. She requests police authorities to investigate a total of 61 people, including, of course, former President Jair Bolsonaro, 8 generals, some of which worked as ministers under Jair Bolsonaro's cabinet, and 2 former force commanders, the former commander of the Army and the former commander of the Navy. And there are some lower staffers in other areas as well. It also requests the investigation of some sponsors of putschist demonstrations, including a lot of people in agribusiness. And it also concludes that the fight against putschism, or the fight for democracy, is not yet over, because there are still a lot of hardcore Bolsonaro supporters and conspiracy theorists in the police, in the armed forces, and in the so-called digital militias.
Now, it's important to remember that these are only recommendations, right, Cedê? Congress does not have the authority to indict anyone, as the word of some Brazilian press reports may suggest.
Yes, so what it does is to request police authorities to investigate. It is not a recommendation for prosecutors to charge or indict, and the committee itself cannot investigate or do things of the sort, but it can recommend to police authorities to start investigations. To speak again of the 2021 pandemic committee, the committee submitted a lot of recommendations for then Prosecutor General Augusto Aras, who basically did nothing on the charges, and he didn't work to actually hold people accountable and hold people responsible for the Bolsonaro administration's mishandling of the pandemic. But that is not a committee's fault. It is a responsibility of the prosecutors.
Now, Cedê, the committee had promised to identify those who financed the riots, just as much as those who incited them. And you mentioned that the committee singled out Jair Bolsonaro as the person shouldering the lion's share of the blame for the riots. But what about those who financed the far-right movement? Were they exposed?
Yes, even though the committee only heard in a hearing one alleged sponsor of the riots, the recommendations include for police to investigate a few of so-called sponsors, especially people in agribusiness. So they were indeed identified. And these people are in the final report.
And Cedê, what happens now?
What happens now is that first, as we are speaking, the report was not voted on yet, but it's very likely to pass. And as we anticipated since the beginning, there was in a report, what the pro-Bolsonaro opposition is going to do is they're going to submit a separate report with their own separate conclusions. And what this report, the report approved by the majority, the report by Senator Elisiane Gama, will add political pressure for the police to investigate and later for prosecutors to charge the people involved, including former President Jair Bolsonaro and some of his closest ministers, 4 of which are retired army generals.
So Cedê, Lula is to name a new prosecutor general. Should we expect that decision to be also shaped by a willingness to go after the January 8th riots with fire and fury?
This remains to be seen. I do not have any enough information on that subject, because the thing is, Lula is trying to whitewash the role of the top brass and the top military and the people in the military that are still in office today, but doesn't care much about the retired military close to Bolsonaro. However, when the president nominates a prosecutor general, he needs to be approved by the Senate. And there are senators who have, for example, visited Bolsonaro rioters. They have visited the January 8 rioters in jail, including the Senate's opposition whip, Rogério Marinho, and others. And there are some senators, such as Magno Malta, who have a very clear public agenda of clearing January 8 rioters for anything. So that might factor in when Lula tries to nominate someone to be prosecutor general, and he wants to nominate someone to be approved by a majority of the Senate. For the last few years, and this happened with Bolsonaro too, is that people appointed to the Supreme Court or to the prosecutor general position, such as Augusto Aras, they are nominated from the so-called garantista people, which basically means people that are in favor of impunity, especially for white-collar crime. And so this also might figure into Lula's understanding, because Lula will definitely not nominate a hardline prosecutor to place putschists and criminals, especially politicians, in jail.
Cedê, thanks for coming in again. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Cedê Silva is the Brazilian Report's correspondent in Brasília. If you like explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It takes only a second, and it will help us reach a wider audience. Or better yet, subscribe to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your memberships fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. Thanks to our subscribers, we have been able to cover Brazil and Latin America extensively, and our work has won and been shortlisted for several international awards. More recently, our newsletters won the Best Newsletter Prize in the Americas from the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers for a small or local newsroom. And in order to keep doing that work, we really need your support. Go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. I'm Gustavo Ribeiro. Thanks for listening. Explaining Brazil will be back next week.